Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our first Washington Passport Network webinar of this academic year. And we're excited to have all of you join us today for our webinar on financial aid applications for Passport to College eligible students. Okay, just some logistics that we wanted to provide for this webinar this afternoon. So wanted to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted later this week on the Washington Passport Network YouTube channels for folks to view at a later time. All attendees have been muted for this webinar. And a note that the chat has been disabled, but we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the presentation. We have staff on deck to answer your questions throughout our hour and a half together. So a little bit about the presenters. With us this afternoon, we have Maria Rebecchi, who is the Director of Scholarship and Financial Aid Education at the College Success Foundation. We also have Dina Murphy, who is the Assistant Director of Financial Aid at Western Washington University, joining us. And then Don Cipriano McCafferty, who is the Assistant Director for the Passport to Careers program at the Washington Student Achievement Council. Don will be managing the Q&A, so any questions that you put in there, she'll keep an eye out for that and answer that with our colleague Trang Tran from the College Success Foundation. And then my name's Donna Quach, and I serve as the program manager for the Washington Passport Network, and I'm with the College Success Foundation, and I'll kind of be facilitating our conversation today with the presenters. So just a quick overview of what you can expect during our hour and a half together. For our agenda today, what we have planned is to provide a brief overview of the Passport to College Promise Scholarship Program. So that's one component of the larger Passport to Careers program. And then in terms of diving more into the content, Maria will be covering the financial aid application, specifically how financial need is determined and how dependency is determined based on the information students provide in their financial aid application. And then Dina Murphy will be covering the financial aid, after what happens with financial aid, she'll be covering the awarding process and then how financial aid is filled based on a student's need. And then for any questions that aren't addressed during the Q&A, will be saved for later this afternoon. We have a question and answer time to do that at the very end, as well as some resources that we'd like to share with all of you. So for the Passport to College program, just a little bit overview for folks who may not be familiar with the scholarship component. Or the scholarship, excuse me. So Passport to College is a state-funded program, and it is administered by the Washington Student Achievement Council, which we refer to as WASFA. This scholarship provides, in addition to funding for students to pursue post-secondary, it is also a program that's coupled with support services. So there are folks on campuses that are called designated support staff that serve kind of as a home base for Passport students attending their college. The Passport to College scholarship specifically serves young people who have experienced foster care or those experiencing unaccompanied homelessness. The award amount for the Passport to College scholarship is $5,000 for the regular academic year. So that is from fall to spring quarters. And then there is additional funding for students who are enrolled for summer quarter as well. And that's on a case-by-case basis in terms of the award amount. How verification for eligibility for the Passport program works is that there are data sharing agreements in place with WASAC and state agencies like DCYF and DSHS, and then currently working on one with the with OSPI to kind of share student eligibility on the back end. And then we wanted to provide just some data. So currently for this academic year, 2021 to 2022, so far the program is serving 647 students, and we're projected to serve about 900 students by the end of this academic year. So at this time, I'd like to hand it off to Maria Rebecchi, and Maria, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So in this section of the webinar, I will cover information to help you or those who are assisting students experiencing foster care or unaccompanied homelessness to complete their free application for federal student aid, FAFSA, or the Washington application for state financial aid, or WASFA. So in thinking of, Donna, if we can move to the next slide, please. In thinking on how need is determined, we need to start talking about the cost of attendance or the annual budget that an institution develops for each student. When discussing the cost of attendance, it is important to consider all of the costs that are associated by attending that particular school. This is also known, as I mentioned, as cost of attendance, and it includes tuition and fees, books and supplies, housing, food, transportation, and personal expenses. It is very important to emphasize to students as they are looking to attend different colleges and they're comparing costs, that they need to look beyond just tuition, because all these other expenses listed on this slide will have to be covered one way or another. In the registration, someone actually posed the question if parents' income affected cost. The short answer is no, but let's consider items that do affect costs. So there are many variables that will affect the price of attending an institution, such as the type of institution, right? So attending a public school versus a private school, 2-year college versus a 4-year university, or a trade school or a technical school. All these types of institutions have varied costs. So the type of school, again, that students enroll will determine the total cost of attendance. The other item that affects cost is the housing plans, right? So whether the student plans to live on campus, which, as we know, the cost of dorms are much more expensive than living off campus many times. So that will change the budget for that student for that year. The other piece is the state residency status will impact tuition costs. And when we're discussing residency, I want to clarify that we're not talking about immigration status, but we're talking about the length of time that the student has lived in a particular state. This is why when a student goes out of state, the cost of attending tends to be higher because they're paying out of state tuition, correct? Something that I want to mention in case you're not aware, here in the state of Washington, as of July of this year, there was a new bill passed, it's the Senate Bill 5194, that changed the definition of in-state resident. And so it stipulates two things. One is that a student will be considered in-state resident, will be considered resident for in-state tuition and in-state financial aid purposes if they have lived in the state of Washington for 12 consecutive years prior to enrolling in college. So you may remember that in the past, that number was 3 years, and it made it much more difficult for students that were moving from out of state to be able to assert their residency in the state. So that is a major win for our students. And the other one is that students don't have to have received their high school diploma or equivalent in the state of Washington in order to be eligible for in-state residency. So again, this is a major win for our students, or the students we work with that tend to be, that they may have arrived in the state more recently. So keep that in mind. And the last piece that I wanted to talk that affects cost is how many credits students are enrolled in each term, right? So usually cost of attendances as they are being developed by the financial aid office assumes that the student is going to be attending full time. So the tuition is going to be reflecting that number, but it's important to remind students that if they change the number of credits they're taking, then the cost may increase or decrease. So these are some of the items, the most common items that are going to affect the total cost of attendance. Next. So as we talk again about how financial need is determined, let's review how financial aid office is calculated. So once your student's FAFSA or WASFA has been filed, that information is processed and sent to all the colleges and universities that the student listed in these applications, right? And then the financial aid offices use this information to determine the student's financial need and eligibility for different types and sources of financial aid. So they start again with that cost of attendance that I just talked about, right? So they develop it for the student, includes all the costs. And important to repeat here is that this number will vary, the cost of attendance, depending on the institution or the school the student attends. To that number, they subtract the EFC or expected family contribution. The expected family contribution is the number that results from submitting the FAFSA or the WASFA. Okay, so it is used by financial aid offices to again determine students' eligibility for different types of financial aid, but especially for grant aid. And this number is important to remember that it will remain constant no matter what institution the student attends. So, I mentioned that the cost of attendance will vary depending on the school, but the EFC will remain constant, okay? And so the result is the student's financial need to cover their educational costs for a year or the maximum amount they can receive in financial aid. So pretty much whatever that cost of attendance is for your student, that is the ceiling of how much financial aid they are eligible to receive. And later in conversations, you'll see why this distinction is important. Next. So let me dive a little bit deeper on the EFC. So as you have heard, using information reported on the FAFSA or the WASFA, these applications processors look at the family's incomes, assets, number of household members, number of those household members attending college, the parent's age, right? So all that information goes into a formula that in turn results into this number called EFC or expected family contribution. In a nutshell, the EFC demonstrates the student's ability to pay for college and determine, among other things, the amount of grant aid that they will qualify for. This is a good source of funding because it doesn't have to be repaid for the most part. So before I go on, I want to quickly clarify that students will complete the FAFSA or the WASFA, not both. And this was also a question that a few of you asked in the registration. So who completes this form? So the FAFSA, which stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid, is an application that most US citizens, US permanent residents or green card holders, and other eligible non-citizens will complete. And when they apply for financial aid with this form, they will be considered for federal, state, institutional, and private aid. Now, the WASFA, which is the Washington Application for State Financial Aid, is the financial aid form used by undocumented students, including those with DACA, even if the DACA permit is expired, and other non-citizens or students who, for different reasons, prefer not to complete the FAFSA. Just to give you a few examples, students who are maybe US citizens, this may be not the case with the students that you work every day, but I thought I would mention it. So US students who are US citizens, but their parents are undocumented and they don't want to necessarily provide their parents' information on a federal form like the FAFSA, or transgender students, for example, since the FAFSA doesn't take into account students who may be transgender. So they have the option of completing the WASFA. So students that complete the WASFA will be considered for state, institutional, and private aid. So as you can see, the difference between these two forms is not only which students complete them, but also that students completing the WASFA will not be considered, will not be eligible for federal financial aid. So that is the main distinction between the two forms. And do remember that students complete only one and not both. So I want to make sure this is clear. If it's not, please use the Q&A to get this clarified, because it's a very important piece that we normally see students getting confused and completing both or completing the wrong one. Okay, next. So a question that many of you probably have is, but whose income should students provide on their FAFSA or their WASFA? So let's take a look and see how both FAFSA and WASFA ask the question, right, of how do they define who is the parent for financial aid purposes. Next. So what's important to know is that when FAFSA or WASFA ask questions about parents, they're only referring to biological or adopted parents, nobody else. So if your student lives in any one of these situations, right, that we see on the screen, so if they're living with foster parents, with legal guardians, grandparents or other relatives, or are on a third-party custody, or another organization, they will not be providing information about any of them. So the students that we're talking about today would not include any adult on their FAFSA or their WASFA. They will only be providing information about themselves and nobody else, no other adult. This is very important. And also I want to clarify that students should not include, also, this is a point of confusion, should not include the person who claims them in their taxes. So it really, for FAFSA, WASFA purposes, at this point in time, because there are major changes coming to these forms for the next financial aid application year, so for 23-24. So as of today, who claims the student on their taxes doesn't matter and should not be included on the FAFSA or the WASFA. So let me spell out a couple of different scenarios to clarify these concepts. Next. So if students are orphaned or have experienced foster care or are a ward of the state at any time after turning 13, and when I say any time, that means even if it was for just one day, right? Then on the FAFSA or the WASFA, they will only list their own income if they had any. Okay. If the student is in a court order or temporary legal guardianship, again, they will only report information about themselves. If they are emancipated, same case, only themselves. If they are unaccompanied youth and self-supporting, also will report information about themselves and nobody else. Now, students who are on a third party custody or an informal guardianship, right? So when there wasn't really an involvement of court or other informal living arrangement, then they may need to report information about their biological parents if income is available, or include no income and follow up with the financial aid office to submit what is called a petition, a dependency override. So students will need to indicate on the FAFSA or the WASFA that they have special circumstances and that they are unable to provide parent information. And then they will follow up with the financial aid office to provide documentation in order to confirm their circumstances. And then the financial aid office make the determination if the student will be allowed not to provide parent information in their FAFSA or their WASFA. I should say that the financial aid office has discretion at this point. Anytime a student submits a dependency override or some type of petition or appeal, as much as the student has the right to submit it, and as much as the financial aid office has the responsibility to consider it, there's always the option that the financial aid office may turn it down. So just to set the right expectations, I wanted to make sure to clarify these. Okay, next. So how is dependency determined, and how does it split students between being dependent and independent? And this is a very important determination because it establishes, again, whose income information should be reported on the FAFSA, the WASFA. And as we saw earlier, it affects the EFC and in turn, the type of aid and amount of aid that they will qualify. So it kind of repeats the same groups that I mentioned, saw in the previous slide, but it's pretty much any student who may be orphaned or have experienced foster care or ward of the court since turning 13, emancipated minors, unaccompanied youth who are also experiencing homelessness or are self-supporting or are at risk of experiencing homelessness, or those who cannot get information from biological parents. And again, in this last category of students, it will be similar to the one I described in the slide before, where they will have to submit a petition with the financial aid office for an exemption on providing parent information on their FAFSA or their WASFA. But this determination is crucial. Being able to answer the right questions that I'll show you now that are presented on the FAFSA or the WASFA are so important because, you know, there's a lot of skip logic on these forms. And so depending on the answer, you know, some questions may be asked or not. And again, it will be determining what kind of additional information the student has to provide. Next. So these are the questions that students are going to see as they complete their FAFSA or their WASFA. The first one is within, you know, there are 7 areas in the FAFSA and the WASFA that students sections that students will have to complete. The first question I'm showing you on the slide, which is, are you a foster youth or were you I think I froze. So this first question you're seeing on the screen, are you a foster youth or were you in foster care, the foster care system anytime, is going to show up in the first section of the FAFSA or the WASFA, which is the student demographics. So if the student answers yes or no, a series of questions will be shown or not, okay? Now, the next section, once they get to the dependency section, there are going to be a couple more questions, right? And so you can see here that some of those questions are at any time since you turned 13, were both of your parents deceased, or were you in foster care, were you a dependent of the court? The same questions that I've been showing you in the prior slides, right? So checking these boxes are going to be very important for students to be able to continue and provide accurate information within the rest of the application. Now, I wanted to pause for a minute and give you a couple of examples of students who would not necessarily qualified as independent that we may see and we see when we're working with students. So for example, if the student is a dependent or ward of the court, but remained in the legal custody of their parents, they wouldn't qualify as independent students. So something to keep in the back of your mind. Or for example, youth in family maintenance, would not qualify unless they were in out-of-home care or at least 1 day after the age of 13. So there are all these little nuances that is important to keep in the back of our minds as we're helping students through this application. Then some foster youth who are under the jurisdiction of the Juvenile Justice Probation Department may be eligible for independent status, but again, there are nuances. So we can do some research and help you out if you encounter a student in these circumstances. And then if they exited foster care before the age of 13 or were reunited with their parents or biological or adopted, they will most likely need to provide information about their parents' parents' income, so they wouldn't be considered independent. They can request an exemption from this requirement. However, as I mentioned earlier, this would not be considered a special circumstance. So the recommendation here is to consult with a financial aid office for more information and guidance. Okay, the last question, next, Donna. The last question I wanted to show you from the FAFSA, the WASFA, is the homelessness question, right? So it's asking the student, seeing if on or after July 1st of this year, if they were experiencing homelessness or were self-supporting or at risk of being homeless. And so it's important to remember that July 1st date is very important. And if they answer yes, then they will be automatically be considered independent. Okay. One thing to remember is that students that answer yes must also be unaccompanied and have the status confirmed with the financial aid office. So I'm going to assume I'm almost done with my section, but I'm going to assume that there are no specific questions for me at this time. So I'll continue. So how does this dependency we've been talking about affects the application process and what are the benefits to being independent? Pretty much, independent students do not have to include any adult or guardian financial information on their FAFSA or their WASFA. And since we know that the expected family contribution is affected by income, and in this case, right, our students would be considered independent, they would only include their own income, the expected family contribution is likely to be zero. And the closer to zero that the EFC is, the higher the eligibility for need-based aid that it is. So that in a nutshell is the benefit, right? So remember, the need is likely to be the full cost of attendance when the EFC is zero. Remember the formula: cost of attendance minus EFC, financial need, and that financial need is what the financial aid office will do their best to try to fulfill with all the different sources of funding that I'm going to talk about next. So this slide is a little bit small and I apologize, but as Donna mentioned, you're going to get a copy of the recording, so you'll be able to pause it and look it on your own time. But what this slide shows you is the 4 different types of aid at the top, right? Grants, scholarships, work study, and loan. And then within each one of them, it tells you where the sources come, right? As I mentioned, federal aid, state aid, private aid, institutional aid, right? And so you can see I listed the most common ones, federal and state, but there are many more. And what you can see also on this slide is what the features. So grants and scholarships tends to be, do not need to be repaid. So that's a great source of funding. Usually they are based on financial need or merit-based. For the grants, students apply to them by completing the FAFSA for the WASFA. There are usually additional forms. For scholarships, one thing we want to make sure to tell students that they should never pay to apply to a scholarship, to make sure as they are applying and receiving scholarships that these are renewable so that they have a sustainable financial plan, right? Not just all the funding for the first year and then what do they do in subsequent years. And then also to know if it's portable, because we know students tend to transfer schools a lot. So we want to make sure that they find out if the scholarship they receive is something that they can transfer from one institution to the other. And this is mainly not for institutional funds that wouldn't be transferable, but from private scholarships, for example. Usually there is a separate application. Many scholarship providers do ask students to also complete a FAFSA for a WASFA. Work study, which is on-campus employment for the most part. There are some work studies which can be off-campus at, for example, nonprofit organizations. They are need-based. This is money that students can earn while working, while studying. It's a great way to connect to the campus. they apply by filling out the FAFSA or the WASFA. And then last but not least, and the least desirable ones, is loans, which are only eligible for students or available for students that complete the FAFSA. This is money that has to be repaid. There are some good ones, there are others that are not so good, so it's important to read the fine print, and students apply by completing the FAFSA. So this is how students or financial aid offices try to fill that need, right? The gap between the cost of attendance and the EFC, so that students can attend school. And the important thing also to remember is that these types of financial aid are stackable. So it's not that they can only receive one, they can receive federal grants and state scholarships and work study, right? To complete to pay for their whole financial need. So I have just covered, one last thing I wanted to say. Donna, if you don't mind passing to the next slide, just messaging for the caring adults that you may come in contact with. If they are caring for a young person who is not their biological child, or they are not their adopted child, right? Or a child they adopted before the age of 13, their financial information will not have to be used in order to determine eligibility for college financial aid. So that concludes my part of the presentation. And so we went over the technical aspects of the application. And now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Dina, from Western Washington, that's going to talk a little bit about what happens after the applications are submitted and what happens on the financial aid office side of things.
Hello, welcome. Yeah, so I think that this is a good segue. I think I'm going to be going into maybe a little bit more detail on some of it, maybe from the financial aid side, how we see that same information. But the most important thing is to just sort of understand that after a student submits their FAFSA and WASFA, sort of the steps that happen. Our schools receive both the data from a FAFSA and a WASFA for students, as long as they've included our school code. So that's really nice, as students can actually list upwards of, I think, 10, 12 different schools, so that they can make sure, especially if they're still deciding what school they want to attend, that all of those schools get that information. And so we bring in that information. We typically do not begin processing financial aid or even sort of looking at that information until a student has started and that admissions process. We get lots and lots of FAFSA data, but the process sort of gets triggered at the point that a student gets admitted. The most important thing, I think, through this time frame and sort of thinking about what's happening next is that many times the financial aid office will be sending out requests for additional information. That's something that students need to be checking their email from the school or the email that they have listed, because that is often the case where students don't get that information. They don't realize they have additional documentation requests and things get delayed. So one of the most common requests in particular for this student population would be documentation or confirmation of either the unaccompanied homeless youth status or their foster care status. I think I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. The other big thing that we would be requesting very often would be verification. The federal government, when students complete a FAFSA, selects certain files that are selected for verification, meaning that the school needs to gather information to substantiate that the FAFSA data is correct. Many times students might be asked to turn in a tax transcript if they file taxes, or they might be asked to confirm that they didn't actually file taxes or that they had no income. So those requests get sent after that FAFSA information or the WASFA information is received. So as long as students are going ahead and getting those requests fulfilled, the next step would be either an award, a financial aid award offer, or in many cases for new students, it might be a financial aid estimated award. The incoming class of students typically are first-year students or freshman students. Because of the time frame in which they need to make a decision about which college they're going to attend, the national day of intent is May 1st. So many times students need to ahead of time figure out which school. So we send estimates to our students at Western. And then potentially later on, if we get documentation, we might change it if that documentation shows that students are either more or less eligible. One thing that's really important for this particular group is that passport scholarship is often put into the award later. Many times I get contacts from students, helpers, support people looking for that on the award letter. And because the passport scholarship, many times we're waiting to identify the students for sure that they're eligible, but many times it is a little bit later. So often students who are passport eligible would get an initial award, and then later on their school may be revising it to include the passport scholarship. Ours typically is sometimes even the summer quarter, you know, that time frame of June, July, before we adjust the award to include that passport scholarship. Sort of the last piece that sort of happens with this is after the award is that new students have made those choices and have confirmed which school, and they will complete that process for confirming admission. And that's typically the last stage of kind of that process related to financial aid. Go to the next one. I provided a general awarding timeline, but this is the really big caution, is that this is going to be completely different potentially at each and every school. But I think it's important to understand in general what might be happening. I would encourage any support person or any helper or any students to check in to just really have a better idea of how this works at the schools that they're applying for. But I used Western as an example. So the FAFSA and the WASFA open up October 1st. That is the date that it opens and is available. So we start uploading all those records. We get the records in, we get our system set up, which is, you know, many of us are just getting through the start of fall quarter, and we're actually thinking about 2022, 2023 right now. And so as we start working through and getting those files in, that's when we send those requests out for additional information. Many schools are doing that. They want to get that information into students' hands so that they know what they need to do and have plenty of time to fulfill those requirements. Typically what happens at our school is for new students, we do start sending out awards or those estimated awards in about January, sometimes maybe a little bit later. Schools will vary on how they do this. I believe there's probably some schools that might be doing it in November, and then some are quite a bit later. The really big piece that I think that is important to know about the differences, there's sort of two different paths. Is we have our first year students process, who we work on at that time frame, January, February, March. We're working on those awards with the intent of trying to make sure that we get those awards ready so that students can have them again before May 1 so they can make a decision. But we also have many students who continue with us, and we call them continuing college students, and those awards are quite a bit later. So the biggest transition at our school and maybe others is that a first year student gets their award letter January, February, March. The second year that they're going to school, January comes, February comes, March, and they're not getting an award. And it feels very foreign and very scary that why haven't I gotten my financial aid? So we do not actually award our continuing students until after July. the state of Washington and budgets and everything, our Board of Trustees sets our tuition mid-June. So we actually wait until that's finalized to do those awards. But the biggest thing is that transition from first year to second year, students believe that they should be getting an award letter early on and might be very concerned. But potentially at schools like ours, that would be pretty normal time frame for that to happen. So we have some information here about confirmation of students from foster care. So there's a couple different pieces. One is the independency status. I believe, you know, the PowerPoint and the webinar so far, we've talked about this. So the question is answering yes to that question about any time since you turned 13, were you an orphan, ward of the court, or in foster care. So schools will get that information and will potentially put out a request for additional information. There is also other ways we sort of identify who might have been in foster care. One of those is that should be a question on all admissions applications. So there is a list that can be provided potentially to financial aid of students who answered that question yes, so that we have one more tool in our toolbox of students who have identified that they have come from the foster care system. In addition, then WASFA provides financial aid with a list of passport eligible students. So we get lots of different ways that we know who is in that. And the foster status is in most cases confirmed through WASAC, through I think their data sharing agreement with DCYF. So what we do at Western is I'm actually able to go in, and anybody who answered yes to that question about foster care, ward of the court, or orphan status, we can actually put their data into the system and get information back to determine that the student has been in the foster care system. So the really great thing about this is that we can actually use that to substantiate or confirm that they meet the independent status for financial aid. So there's the passport eligibility piece, which is very important to get somebody into that system and flagged as a passport eligible student. But it also sometimes helps that we can maybe eliminate or reduce students' requirements for documentation. I don't know if all schools are doing this, and I'm hopeful that many, many do in the financial aid arena, that we could put that in the file, just a nice little screenshot of the documentation as a financial aid person, that the state has confirmed that the student has been in foster care since age 13. The one issue is sometimes our systems put out a documentation request through our system. So students might get a letter that says, please provide us with court documents showing that you are in foster care. It is always worth checking in with the school to find out if that status could be confirmed through the financial aid office's access to this portal. We try and routinely do that, but sometimes we have these requests go out and students could let us know, hey, I'm having difficulty. Is there any way you can make that, look me up and see if that status can be cleared? So then we have eligibility confirmation for the unaccompanied homeless youth. So there's two different sort of categories. One is those students who are graduating high school and will be transitioning to their first year of college. This, you know, as we stated before, is that they have to be in that unaccompanied homeless status on or after July 1st, 2021. And the easiest way is to have that documentation from the high school or homeless liaison. We get lots of different forms that come in from those folks to clear that documentation request that we put out for students. The note here too is that is good for 1 year, one FAFSA year. And so for a second year, it could be a different documentation request if we still are going to be having that. The process for a current college student is different because that time frame that had been previously asked on the FAFSA often does not work for a high school liaison to document once they have moved on sort of to college. What happens though is I have a colleague in my office, Molly, who is the financial aid counselor, that she actually flags the student as eligible through an interview process. So she will have a meeting virtually in this world that we're in right now or in person with students and be able to ascertain that they meet those requirements. The process, then she can document that, and then we can move that student through as being an independent student, which then also we as financial aid, I will go in to the online system and flag them as passport eligible so that WASFA then gets that information to move forward with a passport scholarship. There are a couple other options in which students could be confirmed as unaccompanied homeless youth via the emergency shelter or transitional housing or a homeless youth center. But I guess I would point out this interview process that schools can and should be doing this, that the financial aid department is really responsible for helping students out in this. And rather than trying to get documentation that doesn't exist or doesn't fit the time frame, it is a process in which we should be going ahead and doing that little thing. I think that, you know, Molly talks to students about their situation, kind of where they're living and those basic questions, and can make that flag and document and get the student's file complete. So I think that's an important piece, is that college financial aid departments have the ability to make that work. So we are gonna talk a little bit, this is gonna, you know, talk about more detail of that earlier information about financial aid and what a financial aid award looks like. I am using Western as an example. I know that there's lots of different colleges with lots of different costs associated, but this is a good example. I think Western sort of maybe in that middle ground. But this gives you an idea. We're using the 2021-2022 cost of attendance. I encourage all students to really look at the individual components. I think it's very, very important to understand the true cost of going to college, but also what are those elements? Is that the right amount? Because the schools are required to create a cost of attendance, and often it's based on averages. Tuition and fees is set, but things like room and board and books and supplies, we don't have that individualized per student. So that is an average. The tuition and fees, like I said, is set. It's $8,703 for this year. But shorthand. Books and supplies average $1,011 for the year. Room and board, so that's that food cost as well as living cost. We base that on, at Western, if you're going to live on campus or off campus in your own place with roommates, anything like that, the same. The only time the cost of attendance is different for a student at Western is if they would be living at home with their parents. So in this population of students, unlikely to be often a situation that happens. We know that students have personal expenses. I kind of talk about this being sort of laundry soap, deodorant, toothpaste money, pizza every once in a while, just the cost of having expenses for your personal belongings and stuff. And then transportation. So that is an allowance that is there in case students incur transportation expenses, either to go back and forth, or if they choose to have a car. We also acknowledge the fact that it costs money to, confirm admissions. So there is an enrollment fee of $300. So we actually acknowledge that cost to students to create what we call either a budget or a cost of attendance. So at Western for 21-22, almost $27,000. I think it's important to understand that whole picture, but I also really encourage students to look at, there's personal expenses on there, there's transportation, because those are not billed by the university or the school. That's going to be an area where, do I need funding to cover that? Do I work part-time? Could that cover some of those expenses? Things like that. It's really important to really break down the cost of attendance. So for a student with a 0 expected family contribution, that EFC number, we talked about that. This is an example of the award that student would be eligible for. The maximum federal Pell Grant is $6,495 for the year. The students in most cases would qualify for the maximum Washington College Grant at Western. That figure is $7,532. And the maximum passport scholarship is $5,000. So I do have a little star next to college bound, because this is a very confusing thing for students, in that students will come and say, I know I got college bound. Why isn't it in my award? The way I look at it is from the onset, college bound was, I guess, an early commitment that the state of Washington would provide enough grant funding to cover tuition plus some book money. So because the Washington College Grant and the Passport Scholarship are considered state financial aid, there is no longer a need to have that college bound scholarship meet that need. At Western, the college bound for students who aren't passport is about $500. It sort of tops up. And so what happens sometimes is either college bound will not be on the award, and students are like, but I know I'm college bound. And it's likely because they have a college grant, passport scholarship, or any other state grant funding. The other thing that might happen is a student might get an award with a Pell Grant, a Washington College Grant, and a college bound scholarship, because again, we may not know about passport right away. And then later on, as we do that revision and add passport in, that's when we would pull back that college bound scholarship, because the student's commitment that the state would cover that amount has been now covered by the other sources. So college bound is no longer needed. So that gets very confusing about why that's not there, but I wanted to make sure everybody knew that. And then, so in this example, this particular student would have about $19,000 worth of grant funding. That is free money, all those dollars that do not need to be paid back. So $19,000 is great. It looks good. We've got some great funding in there. But you can see that if a student really felt that they didn't have any resources to pay for the cost, that they are technically short of meeting the cost of attendance. So what schools do is we typically will package or provide other types of financial aid to fill in that gap above and beyond the grant funding. We typically will put grant funding in first and then backfill with these other options. So at a minimum, students would be offered federal student loans to meet potentially the rest of the cost of attendance. So with student loans and those grants, a student could really get that $26,934 met. But we also have other options anytime a student is receiving a scholarship. I know that we have many students who receive governor's scholarship or some other ones, ETV for students from foster care. And potentially work study all go in to sort of fill that gap. And anytime that work study scholarships, any of those other resources, that is just reducing how much loan a student would need. So we always encourage students to seek out the scholarship opportunities, because it just adds on top of the grant funding that is available. So I think that that sort of explains kind of how those dollars work. Can I add one thing before we move on? I did see there was one question I wanted to follow up on. But we do have occasions to find that students, because the FAFSA and the WASFA is considered, they call it prior year, it's really old income. There are circumstances in which a student might have been working quite a bit, and now they're not. And so I think I just want to point out that if for some reason that income that is required to be listed on the FAFSA or the WASFA is really stale, doesn't really represent what's happening when the student is attending college, schools can make a professional judgment decision to use a different period of income so that a student might qualify for better financial aid if when they're starting school, their income is reduced. Or I know some students who work heavily and then, okay, I'm going to school, so I'm going to really reduce my hours or not work at all. So it's important to know that schools have the ability to make that change. And then there was one last question that I saw in the chat, and it was regarding taxability of scholarships and how that affects financial aid. And I think perhaps there was an answer, but I did want to clarify that students in general, I would say, should consult a tax accountant if questions, but in general, grant money, scholarship money, free money, above and beyond tuition and fees and books and supplies is likely taxable income. So that portion that is paying for those, they call qualified educational expenses of tuition, fees, books and supplies, good to go, tax-free. Above and beyond that potentially would be taxed. The question I think was, okay, but then they're putting this income on their FAFSA and then their financial aid is not as good. The FAFSA and the WASFA both actually have something called an income exclusion. And so there's actually a question on the FAFSA and the WASFA that said, did you report any scholarship and grant aid as income on your tax return? What the FAFSA does is actually takes that number and pulls it off of the income. And so say a student had $5,000 worth of taxable grant and scholarship aid, it's part of their adjusted gross income potentially, but the FAFSA and the WASFA actually pull that back out when a student answers that question so that that income is actually not considered as part of the basis of their financial aid calculation. So if a student is feeling that that doesn't feel like what's happening, it's definitely worth checking in with the financial aid office, but that is a process that question will pull off. So there may be tax issues or there may be taxability, but there should not be financial aid consequences or reductions based on a student correctly reporting their scholarship and grant aid. So that's, I just want to make sure everybody heard that.
Thank you, Dina.
Thanks.
That's actually a great segue into our next part here which is resources. So we know that this information was provided really quickly in the last hour to you, so you might have more questions. And so we wanted to provide some resources and context for you after this webinar as you're working with students, applying for financial aid. This is financial aid. The FAFSA WASFA opened on October 1st. We know that many of you are supporting students right now with that process. And so in terms of some resources, this isn't an exhaustive list, but some that came to mind that might be relevant for you. The first one is if you are working with a young person who has questions specifically about their eligibility, we encourage you to contact the WASAC team. That email is provided there. And then for any questions related to FAFSA and WASFA, Maria Rebecchi has made herself available with her contact information there, where you can connect with her and ask her any questions you have related to the applications. The College Success Foundation, part of Maria and Trang's work, is they have created a financial aid hub. And so there's a link provided there. And so if you're interested in seeing what other types of webinars they're hosting, they have a full webinar series and calendar for this year. So I encourage you to check it out to see when their next webinar is hosted, and they have previous PowerPoints and presentations that they've done in the financial aid hub. The next contact are listed here is on the Washington Passport Network website. We have a list of passport to college contacts. So this includes the designated support staff as well as the financial aid administrators on participating passport campuses. So there's about 46 campuses right now that participate or have signed an agreement supporting passport students on their campus. And then on our WPN website, there's a list of other contacts as well, like setup providers and folks who are supporting passport eligible students. The last two we have is if you're interested in learning more about general Washington State financial aid and resources, there's a link there for the WASFA website, and they manage all of the state financial aid for students. And then the last one is information about federal student aid. There's a link provided there as well. So at this time, we wanted to just open it up to see if folks have questions. And so we'll keep the Q&A open for a little bit and just see if any comments come through. All right, so I'm not seeing any comments in the Q&A. Do want to note that we would love your feedback and we welcome that. There is a brief survey at the end of this presentation that will pop up in your browser as soon as this webinar ends, and we encourage you to give us feedback to let us know what are ways that we can improve the WPN webinar series in general, and if you had any feedback on this specific webinar. The next webinar that we have scheduled for the Washington Passport Network is on November 17th, and that one is on coping with holiday stress. More information will be shared through our WPN webinar our WPN email list in the near future. And I'm seeing questions in the chat. Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat at this time. But if you do have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. All right, well, wanted to give a thank you to our presenters for spending the time to create this content for us. And thank you all for joining us for our first webinar of the academic year. And we look forward to seeing you in November. Bye, everyone. Take care.